Shavua Tov, Parashat Vayikra. How are we to understand animal sacrifices, such a central part of our Torah, and yet it is so jarring, one could say, to the modern ear, especially the sin offering. A person commits a sin, and then the animal gets killed. How is that exactly supposed to work? And what's even more puzzling is perhaps the explanation of the Rambam, who says that basically the ancient pagan world practiced animal sacrifices. So in order for the Jews to have a religion, this was adapted from them, sanctified, improved, if you will, but basically it was a reaction to what was happening in the pagan world where animal sacrifices were de rigueur. Very strange Rambam. It's in Moreh Nevuchim, and it needs to be explained because it seems to be that the Rambam is saying that sacrifices are a less than ideal thing, that in fact they were a concession to what was happening in the pagan world. Do we really make such concessions? Don't we have a mitzvah of b'chukotehem lo telechu, not to follow in the ways of the non-Jewish nations? Maybe we should have said the opposite. Just because they brought animal sacrifices, we specifically shouldn't. And yet the Rambam seems to be bringing that. Also, it seems to be that the sacrifices are to wean us away from idolatry. Well, there were some very great people in our history, such as Noah, such as Abraham, and the Avot, who brought sacrifices, and they were certainly not needing any prompting to be weaned away from idolatry. They didn't need sacrifices to get them into the Jewish faith. They believed as they believed. And finally, it seems that the sacrifices would be therefore a temporary measure, what we would call in Hebrew a hora'at sha'ah, that while the pagans were sacrificing animals, we needed this. But nowadays, when pagans don't sacrifice animals anymore, maybe there's no need for sacrifices, and yet we pray for the building of the third temple, and we believe that we will reinstitute, yes, the sacrificial order. So how are we to understand this? Let's start off by saying one thing. Sacrifices are a sublime mitzvah which is applicable at all times and teach us a very fundamental truth of our lives and our relationship with God. And that truth comes forth in one word: responsibility. Let us explain. We have an issue with the sin offering. That is perhaps the most difficult one to understand, that a person commits a sin and the animal dies. This comes into stark focus, yeah, that's the word, on Yom Kippur, where we take two identical goats in the temple. One of them will be chosen by lot to be brought as a sacrifice inside the temple precincts in holiness and purity. The other one will have the sins of Israel confessed upon its head, and then it will be sent forth to perish in the wilderness. That second one is called the Sa'ir HaMishtaleach, or the Sa'ir LaAzazel, the scapegoat, to use the common translation, where the sins are put on this goat, and the goat is sent to perish in the wilderness, and the people will therefore be forgiven. It seems like vicarious atonement, like somehow we put the sins on this goat, and the goat has to pay for all of the misdeeds that we did. Very, very strange. How are we to understand this? There are two of these identical goats. One will be sent forth and one will be sacrificed in the temple. And the rabbis in the Midrash see parallels to two brothers, Jacob and Esav. I think that there is a parallel to two earlier brothers, Cain and Abel. And I was encouraged when I contemplated the Seder Avodah, the Avodah prayer that recites the sacrifice, the Yom Kippur service in the temple, which starts with the beginning of the world and then goes forward to the high priest as he prepares for the momentous day. And it stops and focuses a bit on the two brothers, Cain and Abel. So I think that these two goats could be Cain and Abel. Let's focus on Cain. I don't need to go through the biblical story, but the highlight of the story is that Cain, first of all, refuses to bring an animal sacrifice. He will only bring fruits, and that is by intention. And second of all, after Cain is confronted with his sin of having killed his brother, he casts away from himself all responsibility with the glib response, Hashomer achi anochi, am I my brother's keeper? The answer to which is a resounding, yes, you in a sense are, but he is attempting to say, it's not my fault, don't blame me, I have no responsibility for what happens to my brother. How could he say such a thing, especially when he's being asked it by God? So we go back to the Middle Ages, where we have the great Rabbi Yosef Albo in his book Sefer HaIkarim, where he explains the sin of Cain. The sin of Cain was that he did not want to sacrifice an animal, as Abel had done. Why is that a sin? Because Cain believed that human beings were just a glorified animal. We too were members of the animal kingdom, and although we have certain skills and bells and whistles and features that the average animal does not possess, we are still on the spectrum, on the continuum. Whereas the Torah teaches us not so at all, that humans are fundamentally different from animals. And what is the difference? One word: responsibility. You see, an animal has no responsibility for its actions because it acts completely on instinct. And Cain was saying that human beings are no different. We also act on instinct. And since Cain saw that Abel was able to kill an animal with impunity, so Cain himself didn't feel a problem in killing Abel himself. In other words, it's all part of the spectrum. If that's allowed, then this is allowed. And it's besides that, it's my instinct. It was my impulse. I felt jealous. I felt anger. And I couldn't control myself because as a human, I'm just an animal. I don't really have free choice, do I? And then God says to him, "You darn tootin' do, and you will now pay the price. You'll be responsible." And then Cain gets the message and he says, "Gadol avoni miniso, my sin is great, too great for me to bear." So it is about responsibility. The pagan approach, therefore, of sacrifices is presupposing that man cannot control his behavior and cannot be therefore judged about whether he is good or bad, because we have no choice in the matter. We are all instinct, according to the pagans, and therefore what does man have to do with the sacrifices? He's got to basically bribe the deity to not zap him when the deity wants to zap him, and to reward him and bless him when he brings an extra sacrifice. And so herein lies a fundamental difference in the actual sacrifices themselves and how they came to be chosen. I believe my fellow student at YU, Rabbi Stephen Weil, points this out in an essay, that the laws of sacrifices that we have come from heaven. God tells us the details, and the sacrifices are brought in a very detailed and specific manner. Exactly how long the animal has to be eaten, where it is supposed to be slaughtered, what is supposed to be done with its body, and so forth and so on. Minute details and different rules for each sacrifice. Each sacrifice has its own color, its own unique flavor to it. And this is teaching us that the sacrifices are a very sublime and holy thing filled with detail, but also that they are giving a statement of our responsibility, because the pagan sees a sacrifice as a bribe. The pagan doesn't accept responsibility for his actions. He basically says, "I'll do whatever I want, but I'll bring a really good sacrifice and I'll get away with it." Whereas God says, "No, if you have sinned, then this is a sacrifice you must bring." In other words, the action of bringing the sacrifice is in and of itself an acceptance of responsibility. And so I believe that when the Rambam is referring to the pagan sacrifices and the Jewish sacrifices as a way to wean us from idolatry, it's not weaning us from the practice of the sacrifices, not from the action of the sacrifices, but from the mindset. The mindset of the pagan sacrifice is that a person is not responsible because they have no free choice, and therefore they must bribe the deity. Our sacrifices are the complete and total opposite. Yes, the physical action of sacrificing an animal may be the same, but the detailed laws are, first of all, marking it as different, and second of all, the intention is the exact opposite. The animal sacrifice is basically saying, I am completely responsible for my actions, and I have free choice. And by sacrificing the animal, I am stating that Cain was wrong. I am stating that I am not an animal, and therefore that qualitative difference is expressed in responsibility. And perhaps this is what we do on the high holiday of Yom Kippur. When the temple existed, we send forth the scapegoat with the sins, which is chosen by lot, interestingly enough, by a goral, by a lottery. Because the person might be tempted to say, I sinned because I was fated to sin. I did not have free choice. So we take the goat that is fated to sin, as it were, we put the sins on it, and we bid it farewell, saying, I am now getting rid of this mindset that I am fated to sin, that I don't have free choice. I'm sending it out into the wilderness. And Cain, by the way, after he sinned, his punishment was that he was sent out into the wilderness. He was sent out to wander the world. And so by the service of Yom Kippur, we are making an emphatic statement that we are not helpless, that there is responsibility, that we are not animals. We put that on an animal, we'll send it out, and we say, I now understand that I'm the master of my own actions. And well, if you say it's only relevant in the ancient world, you don't really have to say that, because this pagan mindset, while the practice may have lapsed, the mindset is still very prevalent. As a matter of fact, there's an entire major world religion built upon that very concept, that man is incapable of controlling his impulses, is therefore incapable of being righteous, and he has to have some kind of a sacrifice. And this religion is called Christianity, where they claim that their Messiah became the sacrifice to atone for all of the sins of mankind. Therefore, man is not responsible. So the mindset of casting away responsibility for our actions is still very, very prevalent in the world. And our sacrifices teach us the exact opposite, that we are not animals, we are human beings with a soul, with free choice, and therefore we must take responsibility for our actions. And when humanity starts to do that, the world is going to improve in a dramatic fashion. May we merit the rebuilding of the third temple and the experience of the sacrifices, which we can't really imagine, but understanding them in an entirely different light so that they become something sublime as opposed to what others would portray them as being. Shavua Tov.